For today's lecture, we're going to look at a topic that is both highly technical but also highly political. We're looking at the issue, the single question of how should revocable estate gifts be counted. And as we'll see during the course of the lecture, this involves a lot of technical complexity because we're dealing with difficult sorts of projections, but it also deals with the real politics within organizations of what works and what doesn't work within different organizations in order to encourage the right behavior. So I've titled this lecture Return from Fantasy Island, and we'll spend some time looking at some of the approaches that really are based on little more than fantasy and understanding what are the problems with those approaches, but actually sometimes what are the advantages of such fanciful approaches. So let's start with the first fundamental question, and that question is simply one of why should we count? I mean, there's no reason, there's no rule or law that says that we must count revocable charitable estate gifts as a nonprofit organization, as a fundraising organization. Why should we count them at all? Well, there are some different reasons. One, it is possible that by counting, we can actually raise more money for important causes. This can happen by identifying and rewarding the right behaviors. So this is the technical answer for why we might want to count, which is ultimately that it raises more money, and we care about the causes that various nonprofit organizations represent. And since we care about those causes, we want to raise more money for those causes. Consequently, if we can use a counting system to identify what are the right behaviors and reward what are the right behaviors, then ultimately we can repeat those right behaviors when we define right behaviors as those that generate money for nonprofit organizations to advance their charitable causes. The second reason is more of an internal organizational political reason, and that is to justify investment in planned gift fundraising. The idea here is that we need metrics, we need counting so that we can show that the money being invested today is generating a return. And hopefully it's generating a very positive, encouraging return, because we're dealing with all of this uncertainty of fundraising behavior today that doesn't actually generate dollars until later, or perhaps much, much later. And so because we're dealing with a lot of this uncertainty, it may require that we create some sort of counting system so that those who are tasked with deciding where to invest fundraising dollars within a nonprofit organization will understand how much they should invest in trying to encourage these revocable charitable gifts and wills or other estate gifts. So that's a second reason, is really an internal communication reason, an internal political reason, and also just a management reason of justifying investment in planned gift fundraising. A third reason to count is to simply generate large numbers that will impress an unsophisticated audience. Now, this is something that revocable planned gifts can be really excellent at. There are many different ways to count, some of which are more realistic and some of which are less realistic, but ultimately you can generate very large numbers, and for people that are not thinking through what those numbers mean, they can be very impressive. And there are lots of reasons why we might want to generate very large numbers that will impress an unsophisticated audience. Maybe we want to generate those numbers to influence an internal audience about the importance of the planned gift fundraising that is taking place. Maybe we want to generate those numbers to impress an external audience. Say, for example, we're trying to hit $1 billion campaign, but it's very difficult to raise $1 billion in actual donations, so we can make part of that $1 billion campaign consist of revocable charitable estate gifts that are perhaps, well, certainly not worth $1 today, but help us reach those kinds of goals. And that may be helpful in communicating the organization as being successful or the leadership as being successful. And there are times when that can be an important goal. And so these numbers can be used simply to generate large numbers that are at least superficially impressive. And we'll look more at that as well. So one of the challenges that we have within nonprofit organizations is this persistent difference, this persistent difference in the efficiency of different kinds of fundraising. If we simply look within any organization that has been around for a number of years, and we simply compare the dollars that are raised in a channel to the dollars spent on a fundraising channel. So, for example, we can look at channels like direct mail, like events, major gifts, corporations, foundation relationships, annual gifts. Could be any number of channels of fundraising. What we see in almost every mature organization is that estate giving, what we might think of as planned giving or revocable charitable estate gifts, gifts and wills, estate giving has the lowest fundraising cost per dollar raised. It has the highest efficiency. Now, in many organizations, we reverse that. For example, for events, events tend to have the highest fundraising cost per dollar raised. That is the lowest efficiency, especially if you actually count the time of paid employees for such events. So we have this challenge where we've got different fundraising types of behavior, and yet we have this outlier in estate giving that is dramatically more efficient. It has the lowest fundraising cost per dollar raised. Why would we not see organizations spending more resources in the more efficient area of fundraising? So this is a real question. Why don't organizations invest more in estate giving fundraising? If at any mature organization you can look at that fundraising efficiency and see that one type of fundraising is dramatically more efficient than others, why would you not invest more resources in that type of fundraising? Well, there are some challenges here. There are the challenges of primarily the challenge of the agency problem. And that is, in a broad sense, the agency problem is that the interests of the representative, also known as the agent, differ from the interests of the represented person or entity, also known as the principal. So the agency problem is something that comes up again and again and again in economics and business and all sorts of relationships, whether it be, for example, a real estate agent. A real estate agent is not compensated unless a transaction takes place. So a real estate agent is very much going to be pushing for the sale to take place. So if I am a real estate agent, my interest differs a bit, perhaps from the home seller, because the home seller has a valuable asset even if the sale doesn't take place, whereas the real estate agent has nothing if a sale doesn't take place. So the real estate agent is in a position where it makes more sense to encourage the homeowner to accept a lower offer rather than leave it on the market for a long period of time. Now, there have been actually some very interesting statistical and economic research pieces on that relationship, showing that the real estate agents themselves, if they list their own home, they actually leave it on the market for much, much longer than their typical clients, which is part of this agency problem as well. Another example of an agency problem is, for example, if you have lawyers representing clients in personal injury cases. I used to work in this area of the law and in a law firm that represented plaintiffs, and there were some lawyers who typically did a lot of advertising, did a very high volume of business. The reality is that they were more benefited by settling a high volume of claims, and maybe they were settling those claims at 80% of their real value. Okay, but by settling, the lawyers were able to take their share of a settlement of 80% of the value with very little work, as opposed to going ahead and pushing it all the way through towards more investigation and deposition and trial and all of that very difficult process to push that 80% up to 100%. And so, because from the lawyer's perspective, the amount of time involved in those two outcomes was dramatically different, there was an agency problem where the client would be benefited by pushing it to 100%. But the lawyer financially was benefited by simply settling stacks and stacks and stacks of cases, often settling stacks of cases with the same insurance company representative all at once. And this is something that was economically disadvantageous for the client, more advantageous for the agent, in this case the lawyer, if the agent had a large number of cases at the same time. So, this is why, by the way, if you're looking for somebody to represent you in that kind of case, it's best to get a reference from another lawyer that you know, because they would know the reputation of those in that field, or you can use the rating system in the Martindale-Hubbell system. So this agency problem, we see it again and again across all different kinds of industries where the interests of the representative differ from the interest of the represented person or entity. That's exactly what we've got going on here with estate gifts as well. So the agency problem, think about it this way. Will marketing plan giving help me if I am let's say I am a director of all fundraising, okay? Or perhaps I'm an executive director. Will spending money in plan giving help me if my average time at one institution is, say, 5 years or less? Or if my compensation decisions are made based upon immediate annual returns? You see, the reality of investing in plan gift fundraising is that it takes a while for those benefits to be captured. Now, this, of course, depends upon the age of the audience that you're working with. As you work with an older audience, those benefits at least initially begin to be captured earlier. And so you might begin to get some benefits even within a 5-year time period. But if we're looking at the reality that an executive director, a director of development, a fundraiser, if we're looking at job tenures that are 3 to 5 years in length, if I am making a decision as to whether to invest in a category that is dramatically rewarding for the organization, but it will be rewarding to the organization after I'm gone, and that I will essentially get no compensation and likely no credit for this beneficial activity that benefits the organization, because of course it benefits the organization a number of years after I'm gone, then we have an agency problem. The agency problem having to do with the timing of the benefit of investing in planned gift marketing, and in particular for revocable charitable estate gifts. Now, it's perhaps not quite as bad if we're talking about irrevocable plan giving instruments, because those are counted on the books immediately and perhaps can claim some immediate credit for those. So you see, fundamentally, when we go back to this issue of why do we keep seeing this persistent difference here, that if we've got the highest efficiency in one particular type of fundraising, but we don't see increased investment in that fundraising to represent the reality that it is the highest efficiency. Why is that? Well, it's because the benefit of that has a time delay in it. And to the extent that that time delay exceeds the expected time at the organization of the decision maker, then that delayed benefit essentially becomes irrelevant to the self-interested decisions of the decision maker. That's the agency problem. Some other things that can be brought up when you're looking at these various factors. It is true that no one channel stands by itself. Okay. So, for example, direct mail helps get the word out and the information out about the organization. Direct mail helps events, right? Events, putting those on, can create a sense of community that helps direct mail, and therefore helps all types of annual gifts. Annual gifts help to identify those people who ultimately will form a relationship with the organization and become major donors, right? So all of these things work together, and they all sort of benefit each other. If you have an organization that has a very strong annual gifts program, that's going to make it easier to embark on a major gifts program. If you have an organization that has a very strong events program, the information from events can lead directly into direct mail. If you have a very strong direct mail program, you're probably going to have a strong annual gifts program, which is probably going to help for a major gifts program. And if the people are located in a particular area, having that list of folks that you've identified from direct mail, and you've formed a relationship in annual gifts, and you now have some who have percolated up to be major gifts donors, that's going to help your events even more. And perhaps even some of these relationships can spill over into relationships with folks who represent corporations or foundations. So these things are all, they all feed on each other. That is certainly the case with estate giving as well. You can't start an estate giving program if you don't have a group of donors, right? So these things are all connected. Now, we'll see a bit later that actually estate giving that is encouraging gifts and wills does lead to improvements in subsequent annual gifts. At least we do see that statistical association. So this is the core problem that we're dealing with, which is the agency problem, and that is there is a time delay between the investment in planned gift marketing and the reward in planned gift marketing. This time delay is not just an agency problem, it's also a problem of knowing how to do things the right way. Planned giving is fundamentally different, at least revocable planned giving gifts and wills is fundamentally different than other areas of fundraising, because if we look at these other areas of fundraising, these other channels, if we do something in direct mail that doesn't work, we're going to know that right away, right? If we do something in events and the event, nobody shows up, we're going to know that right away. Major gifts is a little tougher because to do this right, this actually takes multi-year investments and relationships. So a little tougher there, but certainly direct mail, we get an immediate response. Annual gifts, we're going to know pretty quickly if we're messing up there. Major gifts, yeah, okay, it may take a few years. If you're doing this right, your actual rewards may take a few years, but none of that compares to estate giving, where if you're talking about encouraging gifts and wills, because of the time delay, you could actually do things wrong almost forever and not realize it, right? I mean, you could have a reality that people come into an organization, do what's always been done, stay there for about 5 years, which is typical, or less. I mean, fundraising tenures tend to be less than 5 years. Move on, think that they're doing it the right way, move on, the next person inherits it, does the same thing, moves the same metrics. Those metrics may have nothing to do with actually generating dollars at the end. And so you could actually, because of the long time delay, the difference between, when you do the behavior and then when ultimately you get the dollars in, because of that time delay, you can do things wrong for a really long time. And that's one of the realities that's different about encouraging revocable gifts and wills, and the reason why metrics matter a lot more in this area. Okay, so one of the reasons that you might be counting is simply to justify investment in planned giving fundraising. Now, I'll be honest with you. If that is the goal, and I will tell you, I think that's a good goal. The challenge we have here is that this most efficient form of fundraising, we're not getting appropriate investment in. And the reason we're not getting appropriate investment in it is because of this agency problem. So look, if you're counting in such a way that helps you to justify investment in planned gift fundraising, I'm all for that, okay? Because there is dramatic underinvestment in planned gift fundraising at nonprofit organizations. And there's dramatic underinvestment because of the agency problem, because it takes a while to capture all of the benefits, and the decision makers aren't going to be there long enough to capture all of those benefits. So fundamentally, even though I spend all of my time looking at all the demographics and statistics of what really happens, what really works, what really are the best metrics to bring dollars to the organization, if you have a strategy that works within your organization, that motivates decision makers to invest resources in planned giving, then be my guest. Then I have no objection to that whatsoever. If it works, do it. And so consequently, because this is an underinvested area, I tend to be fairly counting agnostic from a political perspective. If you are using a counting system that's absolutely unconnected to reality, absolutely empirically unjustifiable, honestly, not going to bother me at all if you're using that for purely political means. That is, if you're using that for political purposes to justify investment in planned giving. In that category, I would say, if it works, fine, do it. Now, if you want to know, is it an accurate measurement, I'll be more than happy to, have a conversation with you about its accuracy. But if your goal is not accuracy, but your goal is to generate behavior among decision makers, then use what works. So we can count to generate large numbers that will impress an unsophisticated audience. What do I mean when I talk about an unsophisticated audience? Well, there is a misunderstanding of a variety of factors, such as a misunderstanding of time value of money. The idea that even if this was an irrevocable gift for $1 million, that if we have to wait 40 years to get the $1 million, it's not worth $1 million. It's only worth a tiny, tiny fraction of that. Oftentimes there's a misunderstanding of the timing of death. There's the idea that that the revocable commitments of somebody at a young age have substantial value because they have a substantial risk of death. And that's simply not borne out empirically. That is part of actuarial reality, okay? There is also a misunderstanding of the revocable nature of the gift. There is the fantasy that once you are in the will, you will always be in the will, that people do not change their estate plans, and so consequently, these things are written in stone. So there can be a misunderstanding of that. There can also be a misunderstanding of what the will actually does, a misunderstanding of the large number of assets that are typically not controlled by the will. And as we'll see, on average, a will reported by a person in the last survey taking place within the last 0 to 2 years prior to death, that will document on average controls something 38% of the time. The vast majority of the time, the will document controls nothing, and that's just the nature of the will document, that it's only a backup document. It doesn't actually control any assets that have beneficiary designations, transfer on death designation, pay on death designation, joint ownership with right of survivorship, or have no need for retitling. There can also be a misunderstanding of valuing contingent gifts. The idea being that what is the value of, yes, we are named in the will, but only if the children predecease. And what is the relative probability of that? There's a misunderstanding of the value of that. And then finally, there can also be a misunderstanding of the value of generating versus uncovering planned gifts. And that's the idea that it's one thing to go through the process to work with the donor to actually generate a new gift in a will that didn't exist before. It's quite another thing to actually just get people to reveal to you gifts that they've already included in their will, because obviously the one raises new money that wasn't there before. The other doesn't necessarily have any economic impact, unless of course you are changing the way that you communicate and connect with those people in such a way that would generate a higher number of dollars. So those are some examples of misunderstanding that can lead to numbers that are more impressive than they really are if we understand what's taking place there. So let me share with you a story of a way to generate large numbers to impress an unsophisticated audience. So in my first job in planned giving, it was right out of law school, and I was working for a small residential college, and my predecessor was retiring. He had done planned giving for the organization, and one of the things that he would do when he would report to the board on the success in the planned giving program, helping people get planned in their revocable charitable estate gifts and wills, is that he would report two numbers. So in his conversations with donors, and he would actually go through the process of helping them getting all of their plans in order and helping them work with the lawyer to complete those plans. And he would do that whether or not they happened to include a gift to the organization itself. So it was a service for this was a religious college. It was a service for the supporting churches and the people in the churches. And through that planning process, what he would do at the end is he would ask, now, if all of the people that you have named, all of the children, grandchildren, contingent beneficiaries, whoever they might be, if they all died before you, then would you like to leave a gift to the college? And at that point, there were a high proportion of people, especially who've been working with them for a while, who said, oh, yes, of course. Well, in the case that none of my family survives me and there's nobody else left, well, sure, I'd be more than happy to leave a gift at that point to the college. Now, I like to call these the nuclear war contingencies, right? Now, that then led to a report to the board that reported two numbers. One was the gifts and wills, the charitable estate gifts that had been designated, that had been signed, that were primary gifts, meaning, hey, if something happens to me tomorrow, this share goes to the college. And then another much larger number that were simply listed as contingent gifts. Now, what is the value of a contingent gift of a, say, $10 million estate that is contingent upon the, say, 65-year-old client outliving his 4 children in their 40s and his 18 grandchildren that are, from age 1 to 18, right? The answer to that is much, much less value than a lottery ticket, right? Just the probabilities of that are somewhere in the neighborhood of the probabilities of winning a lottery, perhaps even less. And so the actual value of that, not to even get into the fact that it's revocable, that it wouldn't come for a number of years, whatever, the actual value of that kind of a designation, at least in terms of its direct impact for getting dollars from wills, was essentially zero, right? But it allowed the fundraiser to report that we had, for example, 50 million, 100 million in contingent gifts that had been signed. So that was my introduction to the world of plan giving reporting as somebody recently graduated from law school and just new in the fundraising field. That is an example of generating large numbers to impress an unsophisticated audience because of a lack of understanding of, in this case, contingent gifts. There's also the difference between campaigns that seek disclosures versus campaigns that generate gifts. Now, there's nothing wrong with a campaign that seeks disclosures of existing gifts. Those can be very valuable, in particular if organizations know how to then connect with those people in such a way that they will stay connected, that they are listed as top-level connections for the rest of that person's life. Right? Campaigns that seek disclosures can be useful because it allows us to communicate differently with those people. Now they can also be completely useless if we don't communicate differently with those people, and if we allow them to, for example, fall off our communication map when they stop donating, which is actually a typical behavior of people who actually transfer dollars to charity at death, that they stop donating in the last few years prior to death, which is the same time at which they'll be signing their final will or estate planning documents very often. So campaigns to seek disclosures, they can be useful, but they're not actually generating new dollars, okay? They, look, yes, they can identify people, and so maybe they help to make those gifts more secure if there is an effective long-term communication strategy that goes along with that. Fine, I can buy that, but they're not actually new fundraising dollars. You're just finding out what had already existed there before, and you just didn't know about it, okay? That's a very, very different outcome than a campaign that seeks to generate new gifts, that is actually working with existing donors, encouraging them to go through the planning process, perhaps helping them through that planning process to then ultimately get to the signed documents. And so there can be a misunderstanding because if there's a single metric, let's say our only metric is number of people in the legacy society, okay? And the legacy society is defined as anybody who has indicated or documented that they have a gift to our organization. If that's the only outcome, then there's no differentiation between actually raising money and just finding money that has already been raised. You see, and so that can be a misunderstanding of what the fundraising campaign does. So another example of misunderstandings that can lead to very large numbers that are superficially impressive is misunderstanding the risk of death. So let me ask you this question. When does a $228 annual gift count as $1 million for a campaign? Well, if you have a person who is age 31, who takes out $1 million policy, if they're a healthy female, they can get that policy for about $228 per year as a level premium. So if we look at the $1 million and say, wow, this gift is worth $1 million. In fact, the gift is worth $228 a year. Now, over the course of a lifetime, for somebody who is that young, that $228 a year adds up and compounds so that we get the $1 million value at the end of life. But it is certainly far less impressive if we say, hey, we've got a donor who's committed to give us $228 a year for the rest of her life. Like, oh, okay, that's nice. As opposed to saying, we have a new planned gift of $1 million. But if the person is 31 years old, that's the same thing. Essentially, the value, you could think of the concept of the value of a revocable estate gift this way. The value of a revocable estate gift is the same as the value of a term life insurance policy. Now, what is the value of a term life insurance policy if you are the beneficiary? Let's say I have a life insurance policy, just pure term life insurance policy that pays me $1 million if you die. What is the value of that policy to me? Well, the answer is it has a value on a daily basis or an annual basis. So each year that it stays in force, it has a certain value to me. If you're 31 years old, that value is a bit less than $228, okay? Because that is looking at the probability that you're going to die during that year multiplied by the $1 million. Okay, that's the value it has for me. Now, the actuarial reality is that I get that value every day, every year. Maybe it's sort of like, what's the value of a lottery ticket? Okay. Before the numbers are drawn, does that lottery ticket have value? Yes, absolutely it does. Now, of course, if we wait until after the numbers are drawn, then the lottery ticket has no value at that point because we already know what the outcome is. In the same way, a life insurance policy, after the year is over, if the person has not died, has no value. It's the lottery ticket that the numbers weren't drawn, okay? But we don't value life insurance after the fact, in which point its value is, say, the $1 million policy. If you want to know what is the annual value of a $1 million term policy, the annual value is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and then at some point it's $1 million, right? That's the after the fact value. Well, if we actually value what the thing is worth before we have the information, which is the appropriate time to value it, when you get that revocable charitable estate gift, it's like getting a stream of payments that are like getting a stream of lottery tickets, okay? And so we can estimate the value of each of those lottery tickets. So you're getting this stream of payments that may end up lasting so long that ultimately you're able to collect on those lottery tickets, or it may not if the person doesn't keep you in their revocable plans, or if something else happens where they run out of assets or whatever the case may be. But the point is, if you want to add $1 million to your fundraising totals and you're counting revocable estate gifts, if you can get a 31-year-old female to give you $228 as a premium on an insurance policy, you can count that $228 annual gift as $1 million. And most people that you're reporting to when you say we have $1 million revocable estate gift that has been signed by this person at age 31, they may understand that they're going to have to wait a while for that, but they will think of that as a big win. They're not going to think of that as a $228 win, okay? Even though the $1 million revocable gift from somebody who's 31 years old is a $228 per year win. Okay, so there's this misunderstanding of thinking that, we might, it's the same misunderstanding that makes lottery tickets so attractive, right? I mean, we wouldn't buy a lottery ticket, if we came up and said, okay, I'm going to give you the expected value of this lottery ticket. You give me $1 and I'll give you, I'll give you back 40 cents or 30 cents or whatever it might be. Nobody wants to do that, right? Because there's always the hope that it's going to pay off. Well, in this case, there's a misunderstanding of the appropriate level of hope because of a misunderstanding of the risk of death. So if the goal is to raise more money for important causes by identifying and rewarding the right behavior, then we actually need to leave Fantasy Island. We need to leave behind the process of generating all sorts of fun numbers with really big zeros on them that don't actually mean what they appear to mean, that simply play off the misunderstandings of people who have not thought through, what is the value of a revocable gift that may be many, many decades in the future. So if we abandon that and we actually say, no, we want a counting system, and this it should be just an internal counting system. This is not something we communicate with donors. As far as donors go, just communicate things as 100% face value, But in terms of if we are using this as a metric to identify and reward the right behaviors, if we define right in right behaviors as the behaviors that get money to the nonprofit organization, then it helps to know what a planned revocable gift is actually worth. And that is a hard question to answer. So let's look at why that is a hard question to answer. It is a hard question to answer because simply answering that question, what is the planned revocable gift worth, requires that we do a number of different calculations. The first level of calculations could be that we've got to look at what is the certainty of that gift today. In other words, if you had a donor who reports to you or documents to you that they have included your organization in a gift in the will, what is your certainty that if you just shot them right now, that your organization would get any money, right? So certainty of the gift today, this can relate to documentation. In other words, did they just mention it to me in a casual conversation? Maybe they were lying, or maybe they were mistaken, or maybe I misheard them. Maybe they were talking about something they planned to do, but they hadn't gotten around to it. So documentation can help with this issue of how certain are we of that gift if they got hit by a bus and died today, right? But beyond documentation, there's the understanding of assets not controlled by a will. So how certain are we of the gift today if, in fact, I have a document that the person signed and notarized today that they share a copy of with me? My certainty that if they died today, I would get a gift goes up. Now, of course, this is a revocable gift, so they could be showing me documentation that actually was already revoked, right? I could sign a will today, sign another one in the morning, and give you a copy of today's will after I'd signed that new one in the morning. So I could share with you a copy of a will that was only 1 day old, but you don't know it's actually already been revoked, right? So documentation of a revocable gift is, it's not concrete in the sense that it's still revocable. It could have been revoked well before you received that documentation, and certainly could be revoked the moment after you received the documentation. But there's also this understanding of assets not controlled by the will, that if you actually have the will document of even a high net worth individual that names your organization with a very large gift, that will document may not control anything. And so it may be that even though you've been handed that document, and even though that will document hasn't been revoked, that if the the donor who handed it to you immediately died, you may still not get any assets or any gift at all, because it may be that will document doesn't control any assets. So we start with the complexity of just trying to figure out at the moment that the person reveals they have the gift, how certain are we that that gift would exist if the person died today? Of course, we have the other issue now, which is the certainty of the gift tomorrow. In other words, okay, maybe we have a certain level of confidence that if something happened to that donor immediately, we would receive money, but they're probably not going to die today. So how certain are we of the gift tomorrow? Well, these are revocable gifts. So we've got to deal with this issue of the likelihood of revocation, that they could change their mind. They could kick us out of the will. They could sign a new will, or they could, for example, put transfer on death or pay on death or beneficiary designations that go around the will, so that essentially that gift is not functional. There's also the likelihood or possibility of the gift size changing. Now, maybe this gift size changes because the gift itself goes down, right? That I had named you in my organization for a lot of money, and then later I changed my mind. I don't like you as much, and so now I name you for not very much money, right? But it could also be that I might name an organization for a percentage of my estate, right? Okay, say, okay, you guys are going to get, let's say, X percent of my estate, and then maybe over the years that estate actually shrinks. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the gift size, because it's a percentage of the estate, gets smaller. Or maybe that estate gets larger and larger and larger. And so this gift size changes. So in either case, we've got both positive and negative opportunities for a change in the gift size. Either changing the document or changing the size of the estate if either positively or negatively. Now, the size of the estate changing positively would only affect the gift if the gift was a percentage of the estate. If the gift is a dollar amount, then if the estate size got huge, it wouldn't make any difference. But if it fell below that dollar amount, then it would make a difference. So we've got this likelihood of revocation. This is only negative. And then we've got likelihood of gift size changes. This can be positive or negative. All right? So it would seem that if we know the certainty of the gift today and we can calculate the certainty of the gift tomorrow, then we know what a planned gift is worth. But actually, we've got some other factors. We've got some other factors because there are potential spillover factors. What is the effect of including an organization in your will on your subsequent current giving? We're going to look at some positive spillover effects of that. So it may be that the planned gift is worth not just what that planned gift is going to bring in, but also it's worth something else if it has a positive effect on current giving. The other positive spillover effect is that planned gifts can lead to conversion of those revocable gifts to irrevocable gifts. So once I have somebody who said, yes, I have a gift in my will to your organization, that allows me to say, would you like to get a tax deduction for that today? Oh, really? Can I do that? Well, if you make it irrevocable, you can. Here are some planned giving instruments that allow you to make that irrevocable, such as a charitable gift annuity, a charitable remainder trust, a retained life estate, also known as a remainder interest deed, and so forth. So there can be value in the planned revocable gifts based upon the spillover effects of that gift. So these are the factors that we want to look at when we're trying to get a reasonable estimation of what a planned revocable gift is worth. So let's look at what information we have. We've got this issue of certainty of the gift today, which is a factor of documentation and understanding assets not controlled by the will. Now, this is a big deal. The reason I say this is a big deal is when we look at, and this is covered in other lectures, but when we look at the estates where the decedent reported having a signed and witnessed will in their last survey prior to death. This is a lifetime survey called the Health and Retirement Study. We, at this point, had about 12,000, a little over 12,000 decedents who had been in that lifetime study. A little over 7,000 of them had reported in their last survey prior to death that they had a signed and witnessed will. Now, this study tracks where the assets actually went. And so because of that, one of the things that is known from the study is what happened to those will documents. And what we know from at least these 7,150 will documents is that those will documents controlled at least $1 in 38% of the cases. They controlled something in only 38% of the cases. So in 62% of the cases, these will documents reported, these signed and witnessed will documents reported by decedents in 62% of the cases controlled nothing. Now, of course, you have 17% of the cases where the document wasn't found, or the heirs, found it, destroyed it, and lied about it. Most of the cases, though, what we're dealing with is not that the documents weren't found. Most of the cases we're dealing with a scenario that the documents didn't control anything, right? Everything here is that, yes, there was a will document. The heirs indicate, yes, there was a will document, but it didn't control anything, right? So what's happening there? Well, that's understanding that the estate here, we've got the estate was otherwise distributed. Okay, that means that, well, there was joint ownership with right of survivorship, or there was a transfer on death or pay on death designation. We can do this even on real estate in most states now. Or the estate was in a retirement account that had a beneficiary designation, or a life insurance policy that had a beneficiary designation. And so the will document doesn't control any of those things unless the beneficiary designation says the beneficiary is the estate. Or maybe it was controlled by some other trust type of document. Or maybe the assets didn't have titles that needed to go through a probate process to be changed. So the point is that you need to understand that a will document is essentially just a backup document. In most of the cases, almost 2/3 of the cases, a will document controls nothing. And so because of that, and that's because of the titling of other assets. So because of that, when we look at certainty of a gift today, we need to understand that just simply saying that, oh, I've got a copy of the will document, doesn't really tell you what exactly that gift is going to control unless you understand also how the assets are laid out, right? Now, I know there are organizations that really emphasize documentation, right? They really want to check that box. A couple of things to keep in mind about that. One is that these are revocable documents, okay? So if you want to get very precise with documentation, and yet you know these are revocable documents, it would be interesting to understand the justification for that. I can fully document a gift in a will, even though it's a gift that I can change tomorrow. Even though it's a gift that might have actually been changed before you even received that documentation. I can sign a will, I can sign a will document. Maybe I signed it maybe I signed it yesterday. Sign a new will document that revokes it this morning. And then this afternoon, I can share with you a copy of the old will document, right? Or I can sign a will document this morning, give you a copy of it, sign a different will document tomorrow. It is a revocable document. Sometimes I'm fascinated by this focus on documentation of a revocable gift. To me, it's a bit like saying, how do you want to nail your jello to the wall, right? Do you want to nail your jello to the wall with a simple thumbtack, or do you want to attach it to a wall with a big, heavy 10-penny nail? Some people are very focused on attaching their jello to the wall with a big, heavy 10-penny nail. Very strict documentation requirements. And of course, my point is, that's great, but it's still jello, right? It's still a revocable gift. Now, perhaps you could make an argument that if we make people go through that documentation process, it increases their level of commitment to keeping that gift in the estate plan, and that's fine. That's a valid argument, but fundamentally, you can document all day long. You're still documenting jello. You're still documenting something that is revocable, that becomes highly unstable, in particular at the end of life, as we'll look at it in a moment. So certainty of the gift today, if we don't know how the assets are titled, then actually the documentation of a will document itself doesn't tell us much. Okay, that suggests that if we want to be certain about a gift, we at least certain that the gift would have an effect today, we not only have to have documentation, but we have to know how the assets are actually titled or actually held. Now, that may not be the case if you happen to have documentation that you are, let's say, the beneficiary of an IRA. All right? At least in terms of that gift today, you could say, hey, I know what assets are controlled by that beneficiary designation. Right? But these two things are connected. In order to know what is the certainty of the gift today. Now, of course, that's not the most complicated part. More complicated is likelihood of revocation. Okay, likelihood of revocation, because again, these are irrevocable documents. So, what is the likelihood of revocation? Well, we have some information on that. So this is showing the 10-year retention of a charitable estate component, or technically of any charitable estate component, using the nationally representative study, the Health and Retirement Study, that is a lifetime study, tracks people for their entire lifetime every 2 years. And so what we're looking at here for the different age groups is we're looking at let's start with this one. We're looking at everybody who in 1994 said, yes, I have a charitable estate component. And then among that group who is still answering the question in 2004, among those still answering the question, what percentage of those still answering the question still say, I have a charitable estate component? Okay, and the first time this analysis was possible, it was actually possible at that point only with people age 70 and above. The retention rate was a little over 50%. Okay, the second time that was possible, that retention rate was about 55%. The third time that 10-year retention rate could be calculated was in 1998. It started in 1998, and then you check back 10 years later in 2008. That was the first time that this younger age group was included. And so that younger age group, we got a retention rate of about 55%. In that particular study, the retention rate for the older age group was just over 60%. Then again, study looking at it again in 2000 to 2010, the 70 and above sample group gave us about 53%. That age 50 to 69 group gave us about 55%, which is about the number we got again 2004 to 2014. Then it for the group that was sampled 2004 to 2014, it went up a bit. Then the most recent data 2006 to 2016 went down a bit here. So if we look at all of these things and we kind of, put them all together, what that tells us is we've got about a 55% retention rate. So this is telling us the 10-year retention of any charitable estate component. So if, let's say, a person started with organization X, and then 10 years later, they had organization V in there, okay, that is going to be shown as retention of a charitable estate component. Because here we can't observe which charities they've selected. We only know if they have any charity in their estate plan, okay? And so what we're seeing here is the retention rate of any charity in the charitable estate plan. So if you've got a person who is charity switching, we actually can't observe this. And so because we can't observe it, the retention rate of an individual charity necessarily must be less than or equal to this number. Okay, because any charity switching that may have dropped that original charity, but was a plan that continued to have some other charity or replaced it with some other charity, that would show up in this area. They would be a retained gift. So that suggests that we've got about a 55% retention rate. Now, this is just the general retention rate for any charitable estate component. It may be for people that are actually revealing that gift to the organization. They have a higher level of commitment. Maybe that organization has a higher stewardship level for those people, and so maybe their retention rates are going to be higher. These are just general national retention rates. So this deals with the question of the likelihood of revocation. Okay, and what we can say is that the likelihood of revocation for a charitable estate component in general, for adults age 55 and above, is about 55% over a 10-year period. Okay, maybe higher for your individual organization. On average, it is lower than 55% for individual organizations because this is the likelihood of removing the charitable component altogether. There is also the likelihood of gift size changing. Now, there's a couple of different ways that gift size can change. One is the gift within the document itself could change. Okay, so for example, if you've got a gift that was let's say originally listed as $1,000, and then in a new document it is listed as $10,000. Okay, that means the gift went up. Or if it's listed as $500 now, that means the gift went down. The likelihood of gift size changing is more common if we've got a percentage gift. And fundamentally, percentage gifts on average are worth much, much more than specific dollar or financial amount gifts. The reason is that, financial amount gifts tend to be degraded by inflation over time, and so these percentage of the estate gifts are in general, they are worth much more. But their value probably changes on a daily basis, right? If I get a gift that's worth 10% of everything you own, then, the stock market changed today. And if you own stocks or mutual funds or whatever, your net worth changed today. So we can get these regular changing of gifts, in particular with residuary gifts, that is percentage gifts that are a percentage of estates. So because these percentage gifts actually represent the much, much larger gifts, they're the ones that we're more concerned about. And interestingly enough, we do have some information about how estate sizes change. So this comes from an academic journal article that was looking at how do so it's from this academic journal article. This was looking at how do estates change over time. And it was separating between people who did not have a charitable estate component in their estate plan, which is about close to 95% of people, more than 90%, and those that did start out with an initial charitable estate plan. Now, when we track how wealth accumulates over time, and this is using the health and retirement study, so we're starting here at age 50 because this represents the 50 and above population. So if we look at two people who have identical wealth and other characteristics, starting at age 50, and we want to know how is their wealth going to grow on average, what is the typical wealth trajectory. That wealth trajectory is different for people with no charitable estate plan and those with a charitable estate plan. So for people, which is, again, 95% of the population, 94%, for people age 50 and above, with no charitable estate plan, we see that their wealth goes up, 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 and then it peaks. We're peaking around here. This is around retirement age. And then after retirement age, we start consuming that wealth, consuming that wealth. And then, gradually you are consuming wealth down to a lower point as you go through retirement. All right. So that's the typical sort of wealth trajectories, which we expect as people are saving, and then consuming. That wealth trajectory is dramatically different for these folks that have initial charitable estate plans. That is, if you have two people starting with the same wealth at age 50, the people who start with a charitable estate plan, if you check in on them 15, 20 years later, they're going to have dramatically higher wealth than the folks that didn't have a charitable estate plan. So this suggests that, fundamentally, charitable estate donors grow their estates 50 to 100% faster than did others that started with the same initial wealth. Maybe part of that is just the kind of people who make these gifts. Maybe it is also that they're motivated to grow their estate to have a charitable impact. But because of this suggests that if we just use the normal kind of growth pattern for estate size for wealth, we're actually going to be underestimating what the value of a percentage gift to charity is, because people with charity grow their estates faster. So that's some encouraging news. There is the second issue on likelihood of gift size changing. We've got changing because the estate size changes, and we've got changing because the amount changes. Now, we do have some information on this. This comes from the NCPG 2000 study. And unfortunately, one of the results of that study was commonly misinterpreted. It was misinterpreted to say that 90% of planned bequest donors don't change their plans. That's completely false, completely ridiculous. And it is in fact not even possible for this study to have found that result. Instead, what the study showed is that if charity stays in, so this is only for those cases when charity is not dropped, and we know that in about 55% of the cases, the charitable component is retained over a 10-year period. Among those who are over age 50. But if the charity stays in the plan, so we don't have a dropping of the charitable component out, that the person who asked, have they decreased the charitable amount, only about 10% of the time do they say, I've gone into my estate plan and I have decreased my charitable amount. Okay. Now, this is, of course, those with an average age of 58, all right? So if we're actually interested in when the dollars go to charity, dollars actually go to charity in the late 80s, maybe even a bit older. Not in the, certainly not with an average age of 58. So, there's some argument we actually don't care what's happening with a group that, the average age is only in the 50s. But within this group, only 10% chose amount decreased when asked about their overall plan. Has the amount of the charitable bequest ever increased or decreased? So to the extent that this is an accurate representation, it suggests that at least up until the mid-50s, the risk isn't a risk of people changing the percentage amount in the document or the dollar amount in the document. That's a relatively small risk. It is instead the risk of, of what we see here, which is people having a charitable component and then having no charitable component. So that's a little bit about what we know about the certainty of the gift tomorrow. What do we know about the spillover effects on current giving? Well, we are able to track what happens to current giving for people who, and these are only for adults age 50 and above, for people who did not have a charitable component and then later added the charitable component. So again, this is tracking the same people. So if somebody never added a charitable component, they're not in this chart. Okay, this is these observations. So this is 9,439 person years. Total observations, total number of year observations. Shows us, and again, this is we're dealing with constant dollars here. So these are inflation adjusted dollars. It shows us for people who didn't have a charitable component and then they added a charitable component, what was their giving before they added that charitable estate component, and what was their giving after they added that charitable component? And of course, what we see is a pretty substantial increase. Now, so here we know they didn't have a charitable component. Here we know this was their giving after a charitable component. Here, we don't know how much of their giving was after and how much was before they added the charitable estate component. So that's why this is sort of a mixed. We don't know really what this is. Here we know it's definitely after. Here we know it's definitely before. Here we don't know how much was after and how much was before. So we sort of discount this. But it does show that we've got an increase taking place here. And so it may certainly be the case that once you get a donor to treat your organization like a family member, which is essentially what it is when you put an organization in your will document, because for 94% of people in the country, there's the only people in their will documents are, their family, right? So if you get that person to treat your organization like a family member, putting you into their will document, that level of connection with your organization is going to be expressed in a lot of other ways also, that they're going to start treating you differently on the annual gifts as well. And that tends to be what we see here. So again, when we're looking at the value of these revocable charitable estate gifts, we've got a value because of spillover effects on current giving and the potential for converting to irrevocable gifts. Again, this idea is that once you know you're in the will, then why not talk to those donors about irrevocable gifts, right? Why not talk to those donors about a charitable gift annuity, a charitable remainder trust, a remainder interest deed, or a retained life estate? All of those things convert that end-of-life gift from revocable to irrevocable, and they come with massive tax advantages. So that's a motivation for the donor to make that conversion. So if an organization is good at making this conversion, then this is a spillover effect where we actually don't care about any of these things. We don't care the certainty of the gift tomorrow or the certainty of the gift today or documentation or what's going to happen to the estate and all of that, because this is just a lead up to converting them to an actual irrevocable gift that we can 100% count on in terms of its precise value, right? So that's another positive spillover effect. So, it's useful to keep in mind that, look, if these revocable gifts and wills, if in fact they generated nothing, okay, let's say there was no dollars ever going to come in from any gift in a will, okay, let's just take that most ridiculous status. We might still want to engage in gifts and wills, because once we know there's a gift in a will, we can convert that to an irrevocable gift that we do know what to expect in real dollars, or because we're getting that donor to treat the organization like a family member, and that treatment has a spillover effect on current giving, which we do know about. So there's lots of reasons to encourage this other than estimating what you're actually going to get from the ultimate estate transfers. Okay, so let's look now at approaches to counting. We've already seen all of the different issues that may come into play there. So now let's look at what are some different strategies. And I want to share with you 6 different strategies that organizations can use to count. We're going to look at the strategy of just counting the dollars that come in the door. We're going to look at the strategy of just counting the face value, but put it in a separate category. So face value means if I estimate that's $1 million gift today, then it's going to count as $1 million, right? We could do face value plus a separate category plus a minimum age. That's where I say, okay, if I estimate that gift today is worth $1 million, or if I just say, look, that gift tomorrow is going to be worth $1 million, right? We don't even have to present value it. Just put it in a separate category, but say, hey, look, if you're in your 30s or 40s, we're not going to count these things because that takes too long. Maybe you got to be at least 65, right? That's another strategy. We're going to look at the approach of use the present value of the gift as if it were irrevocable. In other words, we do know how to value these gifts if they're irrevocable. So let's just count them as if they're irrevocable. The 5th strategy, and there's some different variations of this we'll look at, is to update the value with revocation adjustments. That is to not only have an initial value, but to have an additional increasing value as the person ages. And then the final approach is to say, no, don't count the gifts. Instead, count the fundraiser behavior only. Okay, so that is those are 6 approaches. We'll look at each one. Okay, so the first approach is very simple. It just says we count bequest gifts when we get the check from the estate. Okay, this is the simple dollars in the door that says, I'm not going to get into any of your funny money counting, any of your weird sort of estimations and all the future value and this could and that could and all of that. I am just a serious person and all I care about is money I can spend. And the only money I can spend is the money that comes in a check that comes in when we get the gift from the estate. This has some advantages. Number one, it's very simple. You don't have to know anything about time value of money. You don't have to know anything about chance of revocation. You don't have to do any of these calculations. You just see, how many checks did we get this year from estates or other estate transfers? Other advantage is it's real. This is actual money you can spend, right? Now, it's problematic because, it's highly variable, right? Some years you're going to have a massive, massive amount of dollars, and other years you'll have relatively few. Now, this is the nature of these kinds of gifts. In any organization, I don't care who it is, these gifts are lumpy. You get one billionaire who dies, and it's going to have a massive impact on your dollars in the door from estate gifts for that year. And are you going to be able to match that total the next year? Absolutely not, right? It is not like annual gifts where, you expect that there are these sort of normal trajectories that happen over time. It is lumpy because wealth is held in very lumpy fashion in this country. The top 1% of wealth holders control a massive share of total wealth. And these gifts are very lumpy. They're not only lumpy on an organizational basis, frankly, they're lumpy on a national basis. Anytime we try to estimate national numbers for bequest gifts, if you want to guess what the number is going to be for next year, legitimately guess that, you're going to be wrong about every time. because either a few billionaires are going to die or they're not going to die. And that very small number of events is going to dramatically shift that total number. But even though dollars in the door is simple, it's real, it's actually not at all helpful. Why? Because it's unrelated to behavior. At least it's unrelated to current behavior, right? So what happens this year, how closely connected is that going to be to fundraising efforts that we're engaged in this year? Probably not real closely connected, okay? Because, again, the reward for this type of fundraising behavior is a reward that is delayed. It is delayed by a number of years. So the actual impact on current dollars from current fundraising efforts in this area are pretty minimal. So if we want to use a measurement to guide our current efforts and activities, this is approximately useless, right? It doesn't help us to say, hey, we got a really big estate gift because a billionaire died. I'm going to, to give a raise to our fantastic planned gift fundraiser who just started last year. Well, no. They didn't necessarily have anything to do with that gift and probably didn't. So it's just unrelated to the current effort and activities. So it's not particularly helpful to us if we want to actually engage in fundraising from estate gifts with appropriate metrics of behavior. So another approach is to simply use face value and call it in a separate category. Now, this is what CASE uses, the Council for Advancement Support of Education. CASE is the fundraising professional group for education, universities, colleges, and such. So this is an approach that simply says, okay, let's say that I write you in my will for $1 million gift. $1 million goes to Texas Tech University. And whatever your documentation requirements are, I give you a copy of my will, etc. Document that I have written you in today for $1 million gift. Now, this approach says, okay, what will we count that as? We will count that as $1 million. That is $1 million gift. We're simply going to list it in a different category because it's not like $1 million check, right? We're not going to try to translate what is the present value of that gift. We're just going to say $1 million gift goes in a separate category. This would also be the case if we say somebody who is age 35 writes us into their will for $1 million gift. Okay, somebody who is 95 writes us into their will for $1 million gift. It's going to count as $1 million in all cases, just face value, but we report it in a separate category. Some advantages of this approach. One, it is simple. We don't worry about time value of money. We don't worry about risk of revocation. We just try to estimate, if you died, how much would the organization get? Okay? Face value. So, for example, if I go and take out a life insurance policy on my life for $1 million and name the university as a beneficiary, the face value of that gift is $1 million. Because if I died today, that's what the university would get. But we put it in a separate category. Okay? Very simple. Other reason is that this is transparent communication with donors. Now, this is very important, and it's one of the reasons why I would be adamant that if you are communicating with donors, the value of the gift is always the face value. If they have written a gift in their will for $1 million, then you better treat that as $1 million gift in all of your communications with the donors. All of these other counting schemes that we're looking at, these are internal schemes. These are internal plans so that we can use to guide appropriate behavior. But in communication with donors, the gifts are always face value gifts. Otherwise, you're going to pointlessly annoy donors by, dealing with things like time value of money and telling them that, your gift isn't worth what you thought it was worth because you're not old enough or, whatever. So those are some great advantages of this strategy. It's simple. It creates transparent communication with donors. And what I would suggest is the only way to communicate with donors, which is to simply use the face value amount. Now, of course, we know without question, this value is too high, right? This is not an appropriate value of that kind of gift by any means. Even if this was a completely irrevocable gift, like if it was 100% funded in a designated account and it was completely irrevocable, nothing could be changed, it would still be way, way, way too high because there's no consideration of the time value of money, right? If this person is going to live on average another 30 years, the value of that gift is a tiny fraction of the face value, right? There is no age adjustment. We're treating the gift, the face value of a gift that happens at the end of life for a 60-year-old the same as for a 95-year-old. And that's just silly. We know that on average, we will have to wait much longer to receive that money from the 60-year-old than from the 95-year-old. And because we have to wait much longer, the present value of that gift is much, much lower. Also, we know the value is too high because these, the value would be too high if these are completely irrevocable, permanently funded gifts. But of course, these are not irrevocable gifts. These can be revoked. The plans can be changed at any point. The state size could change, various other factors like that. So there's no risk of revocation adjustment. This, of course, is a bit silly when we recognize that only 55% of charitable components survive 10 years. The value is way too high when we put no risk of revocation. Now, of course, there could be, again, individual organizations may be able to get a better handle on what their actual revocation is. If you have a long-term legacy society, you can do an audit on that legacy society using, for example, the Social Security Death Database, see how many people have died, and see what percentage of those people actually generated dollars for the organization and their estate gifts, and you could get a better sense of what your actual revocation is, and it may be much better than the national averages, and it may be much worse. But of course, we know this value is too high if we say there's no risk of revocation. Here's another problem with this approach: it incentivizes working with financially inappropriate ages. If you are using this for fundraiser credit, then you are suggesting that a $1 million gift, a $1 million revocable gift from a 35-year-old that you're going to have to wait 50 years to get is worth the same as a $1 million gift from a 98-year-old that you're going to have to wait 3 years to get. Okay? That, of course, is completely ridiculous. And there is the reality that it's kind of a lot easier to work with people in their 30s and 40s than to work with people in their 90s, right? Especially if your fundraisers are in their 30s and 40s, right? If your fundraisers are in their 30s and 40s, they're going to find it a lot easier to work with donors in their 30s and 40s, right? If your fundraisers are in their 50s, they're going to find it easier to work with donors in their 50s, not to work with donors in their 90s. The problem is if we use counting systems that don't adjust for age, that don't have any idea what does time value of money mean, that it's the same if you give me $10,000 today, that's the same as giving me $10,000 in 50 years. No, it's not. Not even close. Not even a tiny fraction of close, right? And so it incentivizes working with financially inappropriate ages. It steers fundraisers away from doing the really hard and valuable work of working with much older donors. And finally, it incentivizes count it and forget it donor abandonment, right? If you are rewarding your fundraisers based upon this strategy, you are telling them you should engage in essentially serial donor abandonment. Why is that? Because once you have counted it, you can get no more credit forever connecting with that donor again. So we sort of do the opposite of recognizing risk of revocation. We treat this as if the risk of revocation was exactly 0%. If the risk of revocation was 0%, then, hey, donor abandonment, be my guest. You know, it's done. They've already signed it. You can move on to the next person, right? But if, in fact, we do have a risk of revocation, then it's kind of a dumb strategy to incentivize this count it and forget it behavior, because it's a strategy that encourages abandoning donors, because it tells the fundraiser, you will get no reward for maintaining these relationships such that there is not revocation of the gift all the way until the end of life. Your reward is to engage in count it and forget it. Go out and start as many relationships as possible, and once they're started, do not stay in contact with those individuals, because you will receive no rewards for staying in contact with those individuals. So those are some of the problems with that approach. And here is a bit of the issue on why traditional counting doesn't work. Traditional counting, of which this is an example, doesn't work because planned giving fundraising measures the beginning step of a process to generate money. Okay, this differs from traditional fundraising that measures the ending step of a process to generate money. And the problem is you have administrators that are used to managing traditional fundraising, and their measurements focus on the ending step of a process to generate money. So let's say you're managing folks who are major gifts officers, okay? Major gift processes can take a long time, all right? They can take years to develop those relationships, to see what the person is interested in, to get them involved with the organization. That can take a very, very long time. But what is measured, aside from the behavioral measurements, the outcome measurements are measuring the ending step of that process, the actual major gift fulfillment. Or major gift, rejection, right? Planned giving fundraising measures the beginning step of a process to generate money. It is the beginning of a relationship that ultimately, if things go well, will generate money for the nonprofit organization. And the problem is that all of these other metrics that managers are used to dealing with, they measure the ending step of the process, and they sometimes will take that same approach to the metric and they'll apply it to planned giving metrics that are measuring the beginning step of the process. And so what happens when you get that is you get the reality that the metrics are then saying you just need to go out and start as many relationships as possible and then never follow up with any of them. That's what's being incentivized. And sometimes managers don't realize that's what they're incentivizing because they're used to incentivizing the measurements that measure the ending step of a long process to generate money, as opposed to these measurements, which are measuring the first step of a long process to generate money. If you only reward the first step of the journey, you're going to get a lot of started journeys, but not very many completed journeys. When we also look at when these decisions are made, we see that these decisions are made at a relatively older age. So, for example, this comes from a national sample of probate records in Australia, and it shows us when the wills were signed that actually controlled the dollars that went to charity. Okay, so this is age at will signing by share of the total bequest dollars transferred. Wills signed in the 80s, 90s, or older, 76% of the dollars. Are you interested in wills signed before age 70? Well, congratulations. You are interested in 13% of the dollars that are actually transferred to charity. Wills signed before age 70 control 13% of the dollars. All right? If you're interested in the other 87% of the dollars, then you're interested in those signed in the 70s or older. If you're interested in 76% of the dollars, then you're interested in wills signed in the 80s or older. Now, one of the things to keep in mind about this information is that these are simply probate records, and so we don't know what the next to the last will included. We know that the last will document, that's what we can see, is this will document. This was the ages when it was signed by the share of total charitable bequest dollars transferred. We know what was in the last will document, but we don't know what existed before that last will document. We know there was some change. If there wasn't a change, there would be no reason to have a new will document, but we don't know if there was in fact a change to the charitable component from this information. However, from U.S. information, we do know that the final will documents being signed at those oldest ages towards the end of life do frequently contain dramatic changes to the charitable component. So this particular analysis looks at those who are in the health and retirement study. Again, it's been going on for over a quarter century. Over 12,000 people have died during the process, and it's actually only looking at those who are decedents who actually transferred dollars to charity at death. And then we go back to their lifetime surveys when they're reporting whether or not they have a charitable component in their estate plan, so that we can identify when was that charitable component added in to the estate plan. And everything in red here, these are estates that added the charitable component in within the last 5 years of death. The majority of all charitable estates added those charitable components in within the last 5 years of death. Meaning specifically, within the last 5 years of death, they had estate plans with zero charity in them. Okay? We also see in some other analysis that, in fact, this is not just a matter of plans getting added, it's also a matter of plans getting dropped. What we see is the reality that plans destabilize, in particular the charitable component of plans destabilize when either death feels near or family structure changes. We've seen this in some of the previous research and studies that in particular towards the end of life, you get a lot of instability. Plans that didn't have charity in them getting charity added, plans that had charity in them having charity dropped. So there's a lot of end-of-life instability in these plans, and also instability that happens just along the way with a change in family structure. So the idea that we can count these as if they are highly stable, once in, always in, just simply does not reflect the reality of the changes that take place in these plans, especially towards the end of life. So we need to recognize that there is a substantial chance of revocation, and that we need to take that into account in the giving approaches. One approach to trying to take this into account a little bit is to still use face value, still report it as a separate category, but have age minimums. In other words, to say, look, if you go out and you get a gift from somebody, or a gift in a will from somebody who's 35 years old, we're not going to report that at face value. In fact, we're going to report it at zero value. So is it better to go from a system that reports everything too high to a system that reports things above the age minimum too high and things below the age minimum too low? Okay. It's up to you, right? Now, it helps because you maintain transparent communication with donors unless the donor's below the age minimum. If the donor's below the age minimum, then you're saying, oh, well, we can't count that for anything. Well, that's not a very enjoyable thing to be able to communicate. So, we don't get time value of money adjustments here, other than to say if it's below this age, then the value is 0. Okay, is that any less wrong than saying face value is 100% for everyone? I mean, it's different wrong. But the advantage it does have is that it is somewhat less of an incentive to work with financially inappropriate ages. So you don't have people spending time with 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds and counting that at face value, and those people are getting the same credit as people working with 80-year-olds and 90-year-olds, okay? So it does help this, and that's the main reason I think to do it. It still suggests that once you get that relationship started, you should abandon the donor because we're not going to give you any credit after that initial commitment has been made. So the biggest improvement I would say is it's slightly better in this category than not having any age minimums. So something to consider as a possibility. This is the approach that says let's go ahead and value them as if this were irrevocable. Now, this is good because it is something that we can do precisely using the IRS remainder interest tables. We can say if this gift was irrevocable, we know if we were guaranteed that we're going to get this gift in the actuarial life expectancy of this person, this is what it's worth. Okay, and there are free tables that we can use to estimate this. So this has the advantage that this is the first counting system that we've encountered so far that actually takes into account the time value of money, right? It actually tells us the difference, the real life, no kidding difference between getting a gift that will a gift of $1,000 that will come at the end of a life of somebody who's 35 versus the $1,000 that will come at the end of a life of somebody who's 95. Okay, so this is the first measurement we've gotten that actually incorporates time value of money, because these remainder interest tables, they're based upon the time value of money and also life expectancy. Now, of course, if you communicated this with donors that you were counting it this way, that would be dumb. Don't do that because what you would be saying is, oh, thank you very much for including that $1 million gift in your will. We so much appreciate it, and we are now crediting you with a gift of $134,000 because of your age, right? Don't do that. Yes, we know that may be the present value of this gift, even if it was an irrevocable gift, but you do not communicate that with donors. You communicate the face value with donors. We don't know, of course, that this value is too high. If we finally are using present value, so hooray for that, but we're counting it as if it was not possible to change it, as if this was an irrevocable gift, we know that that is too high. We know now it is not as high as counting it at face value, but so it is closer to the truth, but it is still too high because we are not making any adjustments for the reality that these are revocable gifts. Okay, risk of revocation, no adjustments there. And so this is an improvement. We are now actually incorporating in the concept of present value. We are now getting closer to an appropriate value, even though we know it's still high. It's at least much, much better than face value or face value over a certain minimum age. But we still have this problem. It still incentivizes count it and forget it if we are only valuing these gifts when they are first reported. Okay, if I only get credit for the gift when the person first reports it, then we've not changed this problem that essentially we are encouraging fundraisers and rewarding fundraisers to engage in donor abandonment, to start as many relationships as possible, but never maintain those relationships. So another perhaps more rational way is to also include some kind of adjustment for the risk of revocation. All right? We know that the value of an irrevocable gift is an upper bound for the value of a revocable gift, at least if we're dealing with a fixed dollar amount. Okay? So the value of $1 million irrevocable gift that the charity receives at the end of life is an upper bound for the value of a revocable gift that the charity receives at the end of life. So we know that the value of a revocable gift of a fixed dollar amount at the end of life can be no greater than the value of an irrevocable gift. And in fact, as the time to death gets smaller and smaller and smaller, the combined risk of revocation also becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And so the revocable gift, the risk of revocation, is smaller depending upon how far away death is. What does that mean? Well, it means simply this. Look, if you're going to live for another 40 years, the chance that you're going to change your estate plan is higher than if you're going to live for another 40 hours. Okay? So these two values, the revocable gift value and the irrevocable gift value, they do converge as death approaches. Right? If you are terminal, you're on hospice, and they say you got a week left to live, and you sign a gift in a will to a charity, that gift is pretty close to the same value as an irrevocable gift, right? The chances that you're going to change that in the next couple of days, very little, right? But again, if you are signing these gifts as somebody who's 38 and you're going to live for another 40 or more years, chance of revocation is much higher. So how do we discount for the risk of revocation? Okay. This is a couple of ways that you can at least put in something, at least put in some factor that not only recognizes that there is a risk of revocation, but recognizes that that risk of revocation is greater if you've got a 40-year period for revocation to occur than it is if you have, say, a 4-month period for revocation to occur. That risk of revocation it increases as the opportunity, the number of years expected for revocation goes up. So a couple of different strategies to do this. One is a strategy that we'll look at that is called double discounting, which is we value the reduction based upon it being an irrevocable gift, and then we do that reduction twice, or we generate a higher interest rate for valuing our irrevocable gift. Now, what I'm going to share with you is an argument that either of these strategies generates features that are similar to directly estimating the annual risk of revocation and the remaining life expectancy. Okay, so essentially what I'm saying is that, yes, you could be an actuarial sort of wonky person like me, and you could say, let's actually do this right. Let's directly estimate the annual risk of revocation and the remaining life expectancy. But what I'm telling you is that if you just do one of these two things, either what we'll talk about double discounting or using a higher interest rate, it's going to create the same result as doing this. Okay, you're going to be in the right ballpark. of doing this complicated thing if you just do this simple thing. Okay, so let's look at these a bit more in detail now. The double discounting approach, and this is a concept that I want to give credit, was first suggested to me by Mick Koster at Carnegie Mellon, is the idea of starting with the valuation of a gift based upon the idea of its valuation as an irrevocable future gift, and then using that same discounting factor again to incorporate the risk of revocation. So we start with the remainder value gift, a remainder value factor, to adjust for the fact that it's going to take a while before you get the gift. And then you use that same factor again as an adjustment to deal with the reality that there is a chance of revocation. And the longer that you have to hold on to that gift, the greater the chance of revocation. So let me give you an example of how that would work. If you have a $100,000 gift that from a person who is age 70, if that gift was irrevocable and let's say interest rates were at 2%, you could go to the IRS tables and you could calculate, actually just look it up, what is the present value of a $100,000 gift that comes to a charity at the end of the life of a person who is currently age 70 with this interest rate. And the answer is the value of that gift, the remainder interest value, is 0.76260 of the $100,000. In other words, the tax deduction for such a gift is $76,260. Now, this is used to value, in particular, this simple formula is used to value remainder interest gifts, such as a remainder interest in farmland. So you can simply look it up on the IRS tables, or you can, if you have charitable plan giving calculation software, you can simply run a calculation for a remainder interest deed in farmland, also known as a life estate in farmland, and you will get this same calculation. So we use this for calculating the value of an irrevocable gift. The reason that we use the interest rate, this interest rate is what's called the 75/20 rate, related to the Internal Revenue Code Section 7520, also known as the Adjusted Federal Midterm Rate, AFR rate. The reason why that we need to consider what the interest rate is that this table considers that this person age 70 is going to live to the life expectancy of the normal person who is age 70. And so at the end of that normal life expectancy, the charity will receive this $100,000. So let's suppose you were dealing with a donor who had a life expectancy of 20 years. What is the present value of being able to get $100,000 when you have to wait 20 years for it? Well, the present value of that depends upon the interest rate. In a very simple way, you can think of it this way. How much do I have to put in the bank today such that it would equal $100,000 at the end of 20 years? Well, if the interest rate is 2%, then I'm going to have to put a lot more into the bank than if my interest rate were 8%. Right? If the interest rate were 8%, I could put a whole lot less in the bank to equal $100,000 at the end of 20 years than if I was only earning 2%. That's why the interest rate is part of this calculation. Okay, so the standard calculation is to use the remainder interest tables. Now, what is not standard is to say, okay, that is a great estimation for the value of an irrevocable gift, but we are valuing a revocable gift. And so as a thumbnail ballpark estimation of the reduction in value because of the fact that this gift is revocable, we are going to make that adjustment again. So we're not just going to take 76.26% of this $100,000. We're then going to take another reduction, 76.26% of the 76.26%. And another way of saying that is we're going to use a reduction in this case of 58.156%. Okay, so this is this multiplied by that equals that. So what that means in a practical sense is that for this particular gift, a $100,000 revocable gift would be by somebody who is age 70 would be valued at $58,156. Now here's the important part. The important part is we not only give the valuation for the initial gift, but we also get valuation for continuing that relationship. So, for example, if I reconfirm with that person at age 77 that they still have this gift, I am rewarded for maintaining that relationship. What is the difference? The difference is about a $10,000 credit. I got $58,000 credit when I first signed the gift, then another $10,000 for reconfirming it a few years later, and now, a few years later, I get another $10,000 credit for once again maintaining that relationship. So this does a couple of different things. One, if you would like to go out and spend all of your time getting revocable gifts and wills from 20-year-olds or 30-year-olds, be my guest. You actually now would get a realistic valuation of what kind of value you are generating for the organization by doing that. So in other words, this number, as the ages go down, this number gets tiny, right? If you're dealing with 30-year-olds, this number, for a person who's age 35, this number is about 19% instead of 58%. So again, it doesn't say you can't go out and get gifts from 19-year-olds, from 35-year-olds, but a gift from a 35-year-old is going to count at about 19% of its face value. A gift from a 70-year-old is going to count at, under this interest rate environment, is going to count at 58%. Of course, if they're 77 years old, it counts at 68%. 85 years old, it counts at 78%. So, you know, if you have the same gift, if it's from somebody who is age 35, you will need to raise 4 or 5 of those to get the same credit as raising one gift from an 85-year-old, right? So 85-year-old is going to give you credit that's 4 to 5 times, a little over 4 times the credit you get for the 35-year-old. So it helps in the valuation of the initial gift, but I would suggest that what's even more valuable is if you can then give credit for maintaining those relationships. In other words, as that person ages, you get credit for maintaining the relationship, for reconfirming by a personal visit that the gift is still there because the gift has become more valuable. And this increased valuation actually increases in its velocity as the person gets older and older. So that is a concept of double discounting that allows you to make some estimation of that difference, and it allows you to take into account what the interest rates are as well. So let me show you the example of the different strategies of how this can be useful. So this is showing the present value of a future gift under different estimation schemes. So let's suppose that you take a strategy where you actually run the calculation. You want to say, we're going to estimate the remainder the value, which is called the remainder value, the present value of a gift, say it's a $100,000 gift, at a 2% interest rate. So a 2% AFR, or 2% 75/20 rate. And we're going to say we assume 99% annual retention. Okay, 99% annual retention means each year you lose 1% of these gifts from revocable plans. Okay, this line, this blue dotted line, this line shows what the valuation would be at each donor age. Now, notice how that blue line with 99% retention is under the red line. What the red line is, this is the irrevocable gift. Okay, if the gift was irrevocable, that would be the valuation of that gift at each age. Okay, if we actually directly calculate the risk of revocation at 1% per year, this is the present value of that gift. And notice that the gap between the irrevocable and the revocable gift narrows over time because the amount of years at which you are at risk for revocation gets lower and lower as you approach the end of life. Okay? If instead you want to say, no, we're not going to assume 99% annual retention, we're going to assume 97% annual retention, then you're looking at this gold dotted line here. Okay, that's what it looks like. Now, that's if you actually run the spreadsheet analysis that does these annual retention rates, and you can do that. But notice how, as a quick thumbnail approach, if you just use the double discounting approach, what do you get? Well, you get a pretty good answer in there, right? You don't have to do all the Excel calculations. You don't have to calculate, whether 99% retention, 97% retention. It's right there in the ballpark, probably what something like a 98% annual retention would look like. But you don't have to do all those calculations. You just go to the IRS table, take that number, multiply the estimated gift size by that number, and then you do it again. And you're done, right? Now, another way to do it is to simply use a higher interest rate. This also works. This is the value of an irrevocable gift at 2%. This is the value of an irrevocable gift at 8%. And of course, it's a lower value because of the time value of money. You would have to put less in the bank to get the same $100,000 at the end of the expected period of life. So that also can work. And that was initially my suggestion as an easy way to do this, but I've actually become a fan of the double discounting strategy because it's so much simpler. Because if you do this one, then you have to argue as to what interest rate do you want to use. There's no sort of natural, automatic, easy answer, whereas double discounting is the super easy answer, right? You just say, well, hey, we're just going to go to the IRS tables. We're going to look up this rate from the IRS tables. And if the rate is, we looked it up, the rate's that, okay? Just going to multiply by that again. So your credit is this percentage. Okay. If you did the same thing for somebody age 77, your credit's going to be this. If you did it for somebody age 85, your credit's going to be this. So regardless of which counting technique you use, I mean, if you want, you could just count it as if it was an irrevocable gift, right? That's the red line. We know that is the upper bound for the value of that gift, of a revocable gift. Okay. The value of an irrevocable gift at the end of life is an upper bound for the value of a revocable gift at the end of life. So whether you decide just to use this value of a revocable gift, or you decide to use any of these other strategies that give you a lower value because of revocability that gradually converges to that value, one of the things that this allows you to do is that I think is very useful is to update the present value of the gift with these revocation adjustments, even if for whatever reason you decide that you just want to value it as an irrevocable gift. Updating the present value can be a powerful strategy to reward the behavior of actually maintaining those relationships with donors. So the key here is we credit the change in value for each personal visit reconfirmation using a constant rate. So by constant rate, that means you've got to, the change in value can't be a change in interest rate, right? You got to have the same interest rate. Either it's the one you started with or the one you've got today. You're just getting credited with the change in value from the last time you got a confirmation to this time that you got a confirmation. So this is another example, not using double discounting, but using instead a different approach, which is using a higher discount rate. So if we use this different approach, how does that work? Well, so it would work by, once again, it would allow us to do the reconfirmation. If I were to raise that, get that gift for $100,000, an end-of-life revocable gift from a person who's age 60, then that gift, getting that gift would credit me with $25,308. Now, by credit, I mean this is fundraiser credit. This is not something the donor ever sees. This is something that says we're rewarding the fundraiser for successfully raising this gift. 7 years later, there's another $10,000 in value from maintaining the relationship. You know, here 6 years later, there's another $10,000 in value. 6 years later, there's another $10,000 in value. And again, here 6 years later, another $10,000 in value. The idea is this is a way that we can actually credit the maintenance of relationships rather than just saying, okay, you got this gift when they were 60, and so you get zero reward for checking in on them, for maintaining that relationship. But because we are updating, and this is the key, updating the present value, then we can continue to give credit for the maintenance of that gift. Now, the nice thing here is from a CFO sort of perspective, even though this is all just kind of internal measurements for metrics and behavior rewarding, is that the gift never gets credited more than once, and it never gets credited more than 100%. Whenever the gift actually comes in and you've got dollars in the door, those dollars in the door will be greater than, that whatever credit has been given to that point, there will still be excess credit that comes in as the gift actually comes in as dollars. So the reason for this strategy is because it does not reward donor abandonment. The reason is that we want to prevent this count it and forget it approach. It is a defensible value. Okay, so is it a perfect value? No, it's not a perfect value. We don't have a perfect value. We don't have perfect information, but it's a good ballpark value, right? If you do double discounting, you're right around, depending upon the interest rate environment, you're right around a 98% annual retention rate. Okay, so it's defensible, it's reasonable. Also, you're not making up your own numbers. You just go right to the standard IRS tables, and you can do that. So what do those tables look like? If you go to the IRS actuarial tables, and in fact, if you just simply type in IRS actuarial tables, that's the first choice that'll come up. If you go to the IRS actuarial tables, what you will see is all of these various publications and all of that. If the gift is coming to you at the death of at the end of life of one person, use single life factors. If it is coming to you at the death of a surviving spouse, last to die remainder factors, and use one of these. You just look at what is your current interest rate. Let's say the interest rate, it doesn't matter what the interest rate is here. You just use this one table. Here you look at, if the interest rate was 2%, you would use this table because it's saying use the factors with those interest rates, right? So let's take, for example, what if we have a donor who says, I have a gift of $100,000 for you in my will. And let's say that donor is age whatever, 60, and we want to use the double discount method. All we do is we click on that table S, and when we click on that table S, what are we going to get? What we're going to get is something that looks exactly like this. You get that table S, you pull it down, and what does it show us here? It says, okay, this is interest at 0.2%. That's not our current interest rate, so we just scoot down to whatever the current interest rate is. If the current interest rate is 1.6%, then we would use this table down here. We've been using examples from 2%, so I'll go ahead and, I missed it. I need to move back up. I'll go ahead and say, okay, we're now looking at interest at 2%. And the number we're interested in is called the remainder amount. That's the value of what's left over at the end of life. And at 2%, we can estimate the remainder amount. That is the value of an irrevocable gift that comes at the end of life for any age. It's always this. It's this column here, right? So if we wanted to estimate what is the value of an irrevocable end-of-life gift for somebody who is, let's say, somebody who's 55. Okay, so somebody who's 55. And we would say, all right, the value, if we're in a 2% interest rate environment, the value of that gift at the end of life is 61.635% of its current value. If we use the double discounting method, we would just say, okay, we're going to take that reduction. We're going to take it twice. And so we get a valuation of about 38%, right? Valuation of 37.99%, right? And so we can credit with that. If we have so if it's $100,000 gift, then we would say this is worth $37,990, $989, if we want to use it like that. If instead we got a gift from somebody who is 65 instead of 55, again, we're using the same strategy here. Somebody who's 65. So we would just say, all right, do the same thing. Use your double discounting, and we're going to give fundraiser credit of 51% of that gift. Now notice that if you've got somebody who's 55 and you maintain that relationship, you come back 10 years later and they're 65, you get a difference of a 12% increase in the credit. Why do you get 12% increase? Because they're older, or technically because they're going to die sooner, right, on average. So that's how you use it. You don't actually need any software. You just pull down the table, pull up the remainder interest after you find your interest rate. So that's what that looks like. You find it here. You can use this URL if you want, or you can just Google IRS actuarial tables, and that's the first result that will that's the first result that will come up. So ultimately, using these tables gives us the opportunity to have a defensible value. It's a good thumbnail value. We're not inventing these numbers ourselves. You just pull them down from those standard IRS tables we just saw. And it incentivizes working with the correct age and, of course, the correct capacity. How much is the gift? So if you want to work with people who are 35 instead of people who are 75, okay, that's fine. But depending upon the interest rate, you're going to need to get 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 times as many gifts from the 35-year-olds as the 75-year-olds. And so it doesn't say you can't work with younger people. It just gives appropriate incentive to working with older people. It also, if you combine it with updating that value, if you're updating it, so every time you reconfirm that gift, the fundraiser gets credit for the increase in value of that gift, it actually means that your only strategy is no longer count it and forget it. That you're not saying you must abandon all of your donors once they make the initial start of that long process, because we will give you no more credit for maintaining those relationships. It actually creates an opportunity with maintaining those relationships. Now, I need to emphasize once again, which I've said before, but it's important. I need to emphasize once again the reality that this is for back office communication only. Do not ever include these kinds of calculations in communications with donors. If a donor has named your organization for a $100,000 gift in their will, that is a $100,000 gift. You can put it in a separate category. You can do whatever you want with it, but it's a $100,000 gift, and you never say anything different. You never say, oh, this is, thank you very much. This will count as a $32,426 gift because of your age. Or, oh, by the way, we're reconfirming that gift, and since you are now closer to death, your gift is worth more. Right? Don't do any of that. This is not for donor communication. For donor communication, everything is always worth the face value. But for back office communication on what sorts of strategies are appropriate to reward fundraiser behavior for, these are the strategies that make more sense. Now, the last strategy that I want to deal with, and this is one that, since we've just spent so much time on demographics and statistics and doing all of these statistical predictions and all of these sorts of things, you may think that I wouldn't like it all, and that's not the case. And that is a strategy that says, the best approach is don't. Don't count revocable gifts. Just count fundraiser behavior directly. In other words, don't reward fundraisers for donor behavior, reward fundraisers for fundraiser behavior. So the idea here is that instead of getting caught up in all these metrics and forcing our donors to give us a copy of the document and how much are we in there for and all that sort of thing, that instead we just want the fundraisers communicating about these kinds of gifts, encouraging these kinds of gifts, and spending time with the right people. Of course, one of the advantages is this avoids the count it and forget it, because we are not in a situation where once the person begins that relationship, that they are automatically excluded from any future connection with the fundraiser, because you can continue to maintain that relationship and you can continue to reward that fundraiser activity. It's also kind of nice because it can reward donor sensitivity in reporting or documenting. We don't have to, with this approach, we don't have to respond to a donor who says, I've actually done that. I've included a gift to your organization in my will. We don't have to respond with, thank you very much. We would really like to receive a copy of that will document. And can you estimate for us about how much you think that gift is? We don't have to do that. Because we're not focused on these kinds of metrics. We're focused on spending the right time with the right people and having these kinds of conversations. Now, this is not a universally ideal solution. It has disadvantages, because the biggest disadvantage is that although it can capture fundraiser effort and fundraiser activity, we may not be able to differentiate between successful and unsuccessful activity. Now, at a minimum, we probably want to have as appropriate activity is combined with the donor's estimated capacity and their age, so that we're spending time with the right people who have the ability at least to make these gifts. But you've still got, fundamentally, even if you're spending time with people the right age and the right capacity, it may be capturing more effort than successful effort. This is also the concern that it doesn't fit with traditional fundraising outcome metrics, which are all about dollars in the door. And of course, we can't effectively use dollars in the door for planned gift fundraising, but this actually just throws out dollars as a whole. and that may be too frightening to folks who are used to traditional fundraising metrics. It also has a problem that it may not generate any exciting news. So what I mean by that is, look, you're not focused on being able to book more revocable gifts. So you can't say, hey, I can book, I've just got a new copy of a will, so I can book a $5 million revocable gift, and we're that much closer to our campaign. Since we're only counting fundraiser activity, we're not generating that sort of exciting news with this type of approach. So, how should revocable planned estate gifts be counted? Here is the perfect answer. The perfect answer is, of course, the only answer that lawyers ever give, which is it depends. The right answer, honestly, is what works for your situation, right? I'm not going to be negative about anybody who uses any sort of counting system that accomplishes the goals that they want to accomplish with their accounting system, with their counting system. It depends upon what is the outcome that you want to generate, and of course, what is your organizational environment. The reality is, if the outcome that you want to generate is to show what a great investment planned giving is, and if the way that you do that is to generate numbers that are ridiculously high, then more power to you, right? Recognize that they're not reality, but that may be the right counting situation for you. If you want to generate numbers that are going to help you focus fundraiser behavior and reward behavior that ultimately leads to dollars to the organization, then you probably are going to need to take a different approach, right? Unrealistic approaches in that case are not that helpful. So that's a little bit about how revocable estate gifts should be counted and the different strategies and approaches. I hope some of it has been of interest and may be useful in different categories and in different organizations. But let me say, this is just an example of how we can take all of this complex statistical information and actually make it very practically useful. Ultimately, hopefully use it to get more dollars for organizations and support these causes in a way that is more effective than we could do without thinking through the demographics and statistics that drive these results.